participants are joining in right now. Right. Good morning and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the start of Climate Week NYC. I'm Daniel Hubble, the Shipping Emissions Campaign Manager for Ocean Conservancy. Today, OC has released a new report entitled Zero Carbon for Shipping, Propelling Investment in South and Central America with Hydrogen-Based Fuels. I want to thank the lead authors at Ricardo Energy and Environment, as well as all those at Environmental Defense Fund Europe and Institute for Climate and Society who contributed to this report and join us as hosts of the discussion today. While it is cliche to say that there has never been a more critical time to discuss the transition to a clean energy future, unfortunately, it bears repeating and likely will again. In just the last 10 days, new reports have detailed the risks of climate change to financial systems, the likelihood climate change will cause mass displacement of people and their communities, and the additive effect of climate change on biodiversity loss. In contrast, the report we're here today focuses on a potential solution for one sector. While in particular, this is discussing the transition of the maritime shipping industry, the results suggest potential benefits to other sectors, to local economies, and of course to achieving climate mitigation goals like those being set by the International Maritime Organization. The IMO's initial GHG strategy calls for sectoral emissions to peak as soon as possible and sets a 2050 goal of reducing GHG emissions by at least 50% from 2008 levels, before decarbonizing fully as a matter of urgency. Urgency is likely a word of the week. In order to restrain warming to within 2 degrees, total decarbonization must actually be achieved within the same time frame. Whether achieving the IMO's goal or the broader goal of halting climate change altogether, the first zero-emission ships must be commercially viable and on the water by 2030. South and Central American countries are critical players in global shipping, and the region is well positioned to reap the advantages of being first adopters of producing and distributing green electrofuels for the shipping sector. And many of the case studies under discussion today show the wide breadth of potential for ports across the world. Thank you all for joining us to discuss the report further, and special thanks to the panelists and our moderator, Nishan Degnarang, who I will introduce in a moment. A few bits of logistics and housekeeping about the webinar. We are recording the webinar and it will be available on YouTube after the session. We also invite the participants to submit their questions via the Q&A function. While our chat function will also be live, if you want the panelists to get your question and either answer on camera or follow up with you over email, please use the Q&A function. This presentation is in English, but we also offer simultaneous translation in Spanish, which is the little globe on the bottom of your dash. Just click that and we will immediately switch over. And with that, I would like to introduce and turn it over to Nishan. Nishan is a development economist with extensive experience and expertise advising governments and other stakeholders on issues related to ocean governance and ocean finance. He wears many hats, and I will name just a few of them. He co-chairs the Blue Finance Initiative at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He also chaired the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Oceans and works with major technology companies on breakthrough solutions for the ocean. Nishan also sits on the board of the National Ocean Council of Mauritius and advises the Chinese government on their national ocean strategy. And finally, he recently authored Soul of the Sea in the Age of the Algorithm, highlighting how the fourth industrial revolution can radically transform ocean governance and restore ocean health. Thank you and good morning, Nishan.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everybody, and what an incredible start to Climate Week in this most incredible year, 2020, the year that the Paris Agreement was supposed to come in force, and obviously the year of coronavirus that impacted many of the big international conferences that were being held on the environment. Shipping is an absolutely critical industry. As many of you no doubt are aware, we have 10 years in which to adjust our course on climate before hitting irreversible climate change. In that 10 years, some of the most critical industries will have to be looked at. Shipping, if shipping was a country in themselves, shipping emits over 1 billion tons of carbon a year. That means that shipping would be the 6th largest emitter in the world. And as many of you no doubt are familiar, that although the rest of the world agreed to nationally bound targets as part of the Paris Agreement, the shipping industry decided to opt out of that and opt out for more voluntary self-regulation. In the last 5 years, some of the progress has been mixed on that trajectory, and we now have a two-horizon perspective. The first is the first 10 years and how do we transition, and as Dan mentioned, by 2030, we need to see zero carbon vessels on the ocean. Dan mentioned one of the hats that I wear. I'm from the island of Mauritius, and in the last 2 months, Mauritius has been dealing with a major oil spill. And in looking at that oil spill from the shipping industry, I have been personally shocked, surprised, and disappointed with the reaction of the shipping industry, the oil industry, and the maritime insurance industry in general. And that just highlights just how big a challenge it is to move towards a zero carbon trajectory and why there needs to be urgency in this sector. When we look at the role of regulation in certain sectors, we see that South America and Central America holds huge potential for how we can transition. And as Dan mentioned, this is an area which may not just be a negative story, but also could be a really important investment opportunity that can both build back better, build back greener, and create more jobs in looking at sustainable fuels for the shipping industry. There are three big options in how we transition there. One is electrifying fleets, two is hydrogen, three is ammonia. There is a controversial fourth option using LNG, but as many reports have shown, there are other concerns with methane that has to be explored. So we're delighted to explore these issues in more detail, to have a very broad panel from Central and South America that covers all important domains. I'll introduce them one by one, and then we'll go into the discussion. First, we have Nick Ash, who is with Ricardo Energy and Environment, one of the main consultants in the environmental space, and has been behind the report on zero carbon for shipping. We also have, hi there, Nick. We also have Christian Chazar. Christian Chazar is from industry, from Ultranav, and he has had a range of very senior positions in vessel fleets as well as tanker operations, and can talk about the need to move towards zero carbon from an industry perspective. And it's important to mention that Ultranav is part of the Getting to Zero Coalition. So there are industry players here who believe it is possible and can be done. We also have Benjamin Molanda, who is joining us from the Ministry of Environment in the government of Chile. And Benjamin's role is to actually develop the hydrogen strategy as well as sustainable marine fuels and how Chile will actually meet this objective. And then finally, we'll have Lavinia Belanda, who is from the Institute of Climate and Society. And Lavinia has also been behind the report of Getting to Zero. And she'll talk from an NGO civil society perspective, being based in Brazil, on what it would take. So with that, the flow of today would be that we will hear first from Nick, who will give an overview of the presentation, some of the highlights, and then we'll turn to some of the other speakers to explain their perspective from some of the industry and NGO and government sides that they represent. With that, let me turn to Nick. And Nick, can you highlight a little bit of your findings from today's report? Thank you.
Thank you, Nishan, and thanks to Dan and Nishan for that excellent introduction. I think that's a great platform to be going into the presentation. So let me share my screen now, and hopefully you'll be able to see that shortly. So it's a great honor for me to be on this panel today, and particularly to present the results from the Zero Carbon for Shipping report. At the beginning of this Climate Week, it's such a great opportunity to be doing this. So without any further ado, let me just give you a little bit more introduction about Ricardo Energy and Environment. So Ricardo is a global strategic consultancy specializing in transport, energy, and scarce resources. We are headquartered in the UK, which is where I'm coming to you from this morning. But we're based around the world. And so we have representation in 21 countries. This is an area that we are particularly interested in. If we look at the vision for the company, it is that we want to create a world where everyone can live sustainably. And so that is accessing clean water, using clean energy, traveling sustainably, breathing clean air, and conserving resources. And the topics in this report really do play to all of these areas in some way or another. So I'll be taking you through those findings of the report in the next few slides. But by way of introduction, I suppose this is a visual representation of what Nishan said earlier about the level of emissions from the global shipping sector. The chart shows emissions between 2007 and 2015. And it shows that if shipping were a country, it would be somewhere in the top 5 or 6 in the world, depending on how you calculate the emissions, whether you include the domestic shipping or fishing. But the bottom line is really that shipping has a very large contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And so it cannot be ignored when looking to achieve the Paris climate goals and even go further. So if you look at it on a global perspective, shipping is responsible for somewhere between 2 and 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions annually. Earlier, Nishan mentioned that the International Maritime Organization, which is the organization that regulates the international shipping sector, has instituted goals to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping sector by 2050, compared to 2008 levels, by 50%. Now, we must stress that this is a minimum ambition that was set in 2018, and they are looking to revisit that in the next few years. But the chart shows that on the current trajectory, the business as usual range is shown by the blue range. And so the dotted green line is what the sector needs to achieve to be able to reach the target of by reducing emissions by at least 50% by 2050. As you can see, it is quite a monumental task, but the sector is now moving towards the first steps and is taking the first few bold steps in moving towards that. And so what we wanted to do in our report is to highlight the potential for so-called electrofuels, green electrofuels, in achieving and exceeding the IMO targets by 2050. So what are green electrofuels, I hear you ask virtually? Well, electrofuels is really just a fancy way of saying, talking about synthetic fuels. So that is man-made fuels that rely on the electrolysis of water to create hydrogen. Now, that hydrogen can be used as a fuel in its own right, or it can be combined with other molecules to make other fuels, like ammonia, like methanol. And those can be used as fuels for shipping. So the prefix green in electrofuel, so green hydrogen or green ammonia, that indicates that the fuel is produced using only renewable energy for the electrolysis. That's to distinguish it from the other possibility of it being produced from fossil fuels, which obviously would not be zero carbon over the life cycle of the fuel. So in our report, we focused on green ammonia and green hydrogen because these are two fuels that are genuinely zero carbon over the full life cycle, from cradle to engine, as it were, where it is used. That it does not, they do not emit greenhouse gas emissions over that whole process. Many different stakeholders within the sector have looked at projections to 2050 for how the shipping sector can achieve its decarbonization aims. And what I've put on the screen is one of those projections from the American Bureau of Shipping, showing the significant contribution that ammonia and hydrogen are expected to play. That's this gray bar at the top over here. And you can see that it's somewhat of an S-curve where there's slightly slower adoption at first. And this is in the first 10 years that Nishan mentioned earlier, and then hopefully gathering momentum in the 2030s and 40s to being taking up a large proportion of the fleet. Now, in the ABS projections, in 2050, there's still more than 50% of the fuels that are fossil fuels by then, but the majority of these represent legacy vessels that would have been manufactured towards the early 2020s, which would still be in the fleet then. So that really does underline the urgency to get momentum built in these early days in the 2020s. And if you look at other projections by other stakeholders from around the world, you'll see similar trends that green ammonia and green hydrogen are expected to play a very important role because of their unique application within shipping. So before I get into the details of our Zero Carbon for Shipping report, just to point out that the technologies that are required to implement zero carbon electrofuels are well understood. So if we look at the renewable electricity resources that are required to produce the fuels, those are available now. The fuel production processes, all of the different constituent parts are well known and are proven in commercial operation. They might not have been all stitched together at the scale that's required for to produce shipping fuels on a global scale, but we're well on our way to getting there. So we can say that they're available now. Bunkering solutions, we know how to store these fuels. We know what needs to be done. We have the technologies to do that. We might not have the infrastructure in the ground, but we know what's required. And so the bunkering infrastructure can be put in place by the time the demand is there. And then finally, the propulsion technologies. There are a number of engine manufacturers that are working as we speak to develop their engine technologies to be able to operate on these fuels. And they project that they will be able to have equipment ready for the industry to be installed on vessels by the mid-2020s. And so we're watching that with great anticipation, and there are press releases every few weeks and months coming out with some very encouraging news as to the progress that's being made on propulsion technologies. Ultimately, through the 2030s and 2040s, with green ammonia and green hydrogen, we'll be working towards using fuel cell technologies and replacing the conventional internal combustion engines, which has even further benefits. So now to tell you a little bit more about our report, which we're very excited about because today is the launch day for our Zero Carbon for Shipping report. You can download it at the link on your screen over there, and I'm sure you'll be provided with the link after this webinar. But the report has been drafted by Ricardo Energy and Environment for Ocean Conservancy, and just to show how this transition to zero carbon fuels for the shipping sector is not only going to enable decarbonization of the shipping sector as a whole, but also there are many other benefits to local communities around the ports that have the foresight to establish these technologies. And so this report looks at some of the some case studies that bring to life some of the potential benefits for these ports. We've got 4 case studies that are highlighted in the report, and really what I've presented here are just a few images to give you a taster of what you can find in more detail in the report. So our first case study is in Brazil at the port of Pecém, and Pecém is a thriving commercial port at the moment. It handles a whole range of various commodities, from containers to fossil fuels to chemicals. And it is co-located with an industrial complex, which has a steel mill, which has a chemical production facility, among others. And so there's a number of different stakeholders there, and many of which are actually potential consumers of hydrogen. So we identified that there's potential offshore of the port to install a wind farm. And so if we install the wind farm of 2 gigawatts, which would be a rather large wind farm by today's standards, but still achievable, then you'd be able to have 5 renewable electrofuel plants right near the port that would be able to provide refueling to zero carbon vessels that visit the port. Another thing that we identified is that if you have a look at the map on the left-hand side, you can see that the port is located on the northeastern shore of Brazil, and it's really conveniently located along busy shipping lanes for ships going to and from the Panama Canal, along the top of along the northern coast of Brazil over here, particularly from the southeastern coast of South America. Also headed up to Europe and the Mediterranean over here, and also the shipping lanes going down to Southern Africa over here. And so there's great potential to not only serve the vessels that normally would visit the port to handle the commodities that are handled there, but the port could eventually grow to become a zero carbon refueling hub for vessels traveling past. And one of the other great things about this case study is that there's a sustainable alternative to some of the carbon fuels that are currently being used at the nearby industrial zone. So there, for instance, at the steel mill, there'd be potential to use hydrogen instead of the coal that they're currently using. And so spillover benefits for other applications as well. The second case study that we looked at is not a single port, but rather it's a cluster of ports around the River Plate on the border of Argentina and Uruguay. And there, as you can see in the map, there's a number of individual ports in this area. And so you have vessels coming from the north and from the south visiting these ports. And so what we wanted to show with this case study is that you could aggregate demand from a number of different ports. And so that collaboration within the port, within the cluster, could provide economies of scale at the early stages. And it gives you some flexibility then to locate a refueling stop local to where there would be good renewable energy resources, for example. And in this area, there are great renewable resources. The map to the right-hand side shows some of the wind speeds in this area, particularly offshore. There's some very high wind speeds, average wind speeds that are amenable to the installation of offshore wind farms. And there's also good potential for solar in some of the areas around here, as well as onshore wind. So that's the second case study for Argentina and Uruguay. The third one is moving right towards the north of the continent in Colombia with the existing Puerto Bolivar. Now, this port is currently focused on the export of coal from a nearby coal mine. And so what we identified with this port is that there's a fantastic opportunity here for a just transition for the local community that is currently dependent on the mining and export of coal to move from that dependency now. If the port were to be able to install infrastructure to provide refueling for zero carbon vessels, then the local community and economy could slowly transition to a more sustainable future. And so if you have a look at the map on the right-hand side, again, you can see the shipping lanes coming towards the Panama Canal over here, and from that region, there's a huge volume of ships that need to come over the northern tip of the South American continent, which will pass right by this port, which is shown here in this peninsula over here. And so there would be great potential to have demand from vessels passing by, vessels that are zero carbon vessels, and taking that step towards providing zero carbon bunkering would allow the local community to start to make that transition from being dependent on coal as it is now. As the demand for coal drops off around the world, again for decarbonization reasons, they could make up for that difference in port activity by investing in electrofuels plants, which we see as a really great positive story for the local community. And then the final case study is on the other side, on the west coast, in the country of Peru, where there is currently a port which is focused on the export of iron ore. So there is an iron mine, which is an iron ore mine, which is near the port over here, and that is primarily used to export the iron ore. So in this case study, we saw great potential to combine an offshore wind farm with an onshore wind farm and a large solar farm to provide the renewable electricity requirements for this port. And one of the great things about this port is that it's got a dedicated route to the consumer port, which is in New Orleans. And so there is an opportunity here to set up a zero carbon bunkering zero carbon corridor, as it were, where you could have ships that are dedicated to this lane that are able to refuel at both sides with the zero carbon fuel. And so that would be a great way of demonstrating the potential benefits. So really, that is just a taster for what's in the Zero Carbon for Shipping report. But one of the key points that we wanted to make in the report is that the case studies bring out some of the interesting stories for particular ports, but those stories are also translatable to other ports in Central and South America, as well as indeed around the world. And some of the additional benefits over and above the great benefit of decarbonization are some of the economic spillover benefits that are listed here. And that is to help to reduce the costs of renewable electricity, to help to create long-term jobs in the sustainable infrastructure and sustainable industries, to reduce reliance on imported fossil fuels, to replace some of that with locally produced sustainable zero carbon fuels. And then finally, that there's potential to build up supply chains for hydrogen to decarbonize other sectors as well. So thank you very much for your time. Nishan, I'll hand back to you now, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Terrific. Thank you, Nick, and thank you for that overview. And I think one of the things that you've mentioned, which is very positive, was how much of an economic stimulus this is. And correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, but I think in your report, you talk about something like $2 trillion worth of investment potential into this sector over the next 30 years. So maybe just you spend 30 seconds just explaining like how big these numbers are.
Yeah, thanks, Nishan. So the 2 trillion number is, it's a huge number. It sounds like a big number, but that was a number that was calculated by the Getting to Zero Coalition. And it looks at what is the gross investment potential. So it's important to look at it as potential investment rather than as costs. And that's between now and 2050 to fully decarbonize the shipping sector, which is an amazing ambition. But that number actually pales into insignificance almost when you compare it to the costs and the investment that goes into the energy sector every year. So I think that it's also in the region of 1 to 3 trillion in recent years, that's investment in the energy sector. So that's a similar amount spread over 30 years. Then you start to realize it's not as insurmountable as it may initially appear.
But it's a huge stimulus for those who are looking to invest in that sector. There's a $2 trillion opportunity to actually invest and create jobs in a completely new sector. So Nick, with that, thanks very much. We'll come back to you shortly. I now like to turn to Christian Chazar. And from an industry perspective, before I turn to Christian, I'd like to ask all those in the audience, if you would like to ask questions as Christian or Nick or Lavinia or Benjamin are speaking, please feel free to do so. There's a Q&A box at the bottom. I'm sure everybody's familiar now with how Zoom works after 6+ months of the coronavirus. So please feel free to ask questions. We are reading those questions. And Zorab has asked some great questions about the role of fossil fuels. And so that's an important context, Christian, before we come to you, because Christian has spent time, as I mentioned, with Ultranav, which is a major transport service provider. He's been part of, or his organization has been part of the Getting to Zero Coalition. He's held a range of senior positions in the shipping industry. And Christian, I think that's one of the questions on many of our minds. If you look at every other transportation sector, whether it's road transport or aviation, there are big breakthroughs. There's an energy revolution in battery storage and alternative fuels. And it's a puzzle why the shipping industry has just not moved in line with that. So with that, maybe you can start by just asking, is it possible to achieve these big, bold targets that Nick has highlighted?
Thank you, Nishan. Do you hear me well?
I hear you perfectly.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I think it's possible. You know that we as a shipping company and as an industry are committed to moving in the directions that is required in order to experience this transition into clean fuels for our industry. So we do think it's possible. We are committed to advancing the deadlines that have been imposed so far by regulation and by the Maritime Organization, because things need to happen at a pace which is getting in a way closer. So the industry is committed to that, and I do think it's possible to reach that. Perfect. So if you allow me to share my presentation, I hope this works. It's just a few slides. Just a sec. So do you see that well? Let me.
Perfect. Yeah, we see the screen very clearly. Zero carbon for shipping. So over to you.
Excellent. Thanks very much again, Nishan, for the introduction. Thanks to Ocean Conservancy for the invitation to address this audience. It's a pleasure for me to do that. I'd like to share just a few slides with you in relation to our view as a company, as an industry, also in relation to this very relevant subject. And which we are, I would think, a smaller part of, but nonetheless quite important. Just a few words about our company. We are, as you mentioned, part of the Ultranav group, which is present in shipping activities on the tankers, gas, dry bulk, and coastal trades, as well as towage and salvage and offshore services. And we are part of a larger group called the Ultramar Group, which is also present in agency and ports and logistics. On the shipping side, we employ about 4,000 people, out of which 3,200 are seafarers. We are present in 15 countries. Our headquarters are in Santiago de Chile in South America. So this report comes a bit to talk about an area where we have been present for since we started. But we do have very important offices in Denmark as well for the dry bulk and the gas side, as well as other offices and commercial offices in many other countries, in total 15. We do operate close to 300 ships currently, out of which we own around 80. Plus the over 100 tugboats, PSV, and barges, which are mainly engaged in South America, Southern and Central America. In relation to this transition of zero carbon for shipping, it is a reality. That's one of the main messages on our side. Shipping, as you know, relies heavily on fossil fuels these days. It emits around 2 to 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. As Nick mentioned, if we were to be compared with a country, we would be probably around number 5 or 6 in terms of CO2 emissions. But it is also important to keep in mind that shipping transports close to 80% of global trade by volume. So in terms of, in relative terms, compared to other transportation needs, of course, shipping is you could call it quite a green way of transportation, in the sense that it emits very few only per ton mile transported. To curb emissions from shipping, decarbonization targets set by IMO aim at achieving reductions of around 50% or minimum 50% by 2050 as compared to 2008. So there is some work to be done in order to achieve that, which needs to start rather soon. The industry will require the adoption of zero carbon fuels rather sooner than later. This needs to be happening at a time where it allows also to comply with this over 2050, which takes into account the lifetime of ships, which is around 20 to 25 years. Commercially viable zero emission vessels must start entering the global fleet by 2030, and then significantly scaling up thereafter in the next 2 decades. And in order to reach that, it requires the collaboration of a whole sector from different sides. Maritime industry, energy sector, financial sector, governments, IGOs, and it requires contribution from all these sides. So the industry members in shipping are actively working together already. We have started some 2 years back, building on some initiatives, this getting to zero collision, which is inserted within the Global Maritime Forum. Getting to Zero Coalition is a powerful alliance of more than 120 companies within the maritime, energy, infrastructure, and finance sector, and is supported by key governments and IGOs. And the important part of it, and one of the main ambitions, is that the coalition is committed to getting commercially viable deep sea zero emission vessels powered by zero emission fuels into operation by 2030. And this is what we are working for at this very moment already. Opportunities, as the report presented by Nick highlights, there's a lot of opportunities linked to this energy transition to shipping. It needs to be supported by a very relevant infrastructure, which is scalable. It includes production, distribution, storage, and bunkering, so a whole range of activities that are part of this transition, and which can be supported by shipping demand. So we do know that the shipping can provide a certain part of the demand in order to get these projects moving in the different parts of the world, and in the case, as the report highlights, in South America as well. Substantial development gains can be obtained by the countries through the investment in energy projects, particularly in developing and middle income countries. The report also addresses the effects on the economies, on import-exports, on the creation of green jobs, and a lot of other positive side effects that this transition offers as opportunities. And countries in South and Central America are very well placed in this scenario. The Getting to Zero Coalition has established some work streams. One of these is also centered in Chile, which is a country that provides some opportunities. I assume that Benjamin from the Ministry of Energy, who will address us in a while, will also show us a bit more about these opportunities that are linked in particular to Chile and the production of hydrogen with the green solar energy. But of course, the whole transition also has some challenges for shipping. Various alternative fuels are emerging, and as Nick also highlighted, green hydrogen and green ammonia, which is you could call it a power fuel, a synthetic fuel, where some molecules are added to hydrogen, are the preferred options so far. The good thing about them is that they do not emit any carbon in their life cycle. So if they are produced with the green electricity. And of course, there's also some challenges associated to green hydrogen and green ammonia as fuels for shipping. One of them, of course, is the development of the technical solution for marine propulsions, which is underway. There is the developments underway, but there is challenges in this technology so far. Also in handling the product on board the ships. As you know, hydrogen requires to be transported at very, very low temperatures in order to keep it liquid and handled on board. And there is an effect of the cargo space that it would take on a ship to manage hydrogen on board in relation to its energy density. So it would take some space on board, which is also a problem that needs to be solved. Green electrofuels are expected to be more expensive than fossil fuel alternatives, and that requires also some policy intervention and support from the industry, from our charters to engage in projects that allow for financing of these solutions and to cover the extra costs involved. There was a word also about the significant investments in this, out of which 75% corresponds to onshore supply and the supply chain and the infrastructure. Only in the projects that are mentioned by the study presented by Nick, in the area of South America, the opportunities for investment were in the range of between 420 to 630 billion dollars. So it's a very significant amount of money. And for shipping, they come for the shipping side in a scenario where also the demand for the services is being under challenge itself, because with this, fossil fuels will come down in terms of the need for their transportation, and that will of course have an effect on tanker demand. But the good news is that the progress is being made on all these fronts. There is a lot of progress made already in marine propulsions by different yards and institutions, particularly in the Far East. There is already advances in the carriage of hydrogen itself. And you can basically read by the day about progress made on various fronts that will, I think, be always a very important contribution to achieve this transition. So this is basically what I had, Nishan, and I'm looking forward also to any particular questions that may come in the panel coming forward. So I leave it with you then.
Thank you, Christian, and a reminder to anybody participating, please feel free to ask questions. We're seeing a series of questions come through. So if you have questions for Christian and any of the other panelists, please ask that. Christian mentioned Chile, and we're thrilled to have Benjamin Molunda here to join us. And I think I misintroduced you earlier, Benjamin. You're from actually the Ministry of Energy, not the Ministry of Environment. So I apologize for that introduction earlier, which is even more important when you look at the role of energy, especially the work that you're doing to lead green energy. And we heard from Christian some of the challenges which he had mentioned, which is mainly technical in terms of the R&D, and also the need for some finance and some policy levers. So it'll be interesting to hear how a government like Chile, strategically positioned, looking at this ambitious target, is looking to incentivize this transition into zero carbon ship fuel. So with that, I'll pass over to you, Benjamin.
Thanks, Nishan. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to give a very quick overview from the Ministry of Energy, as you mentioned, Nishan, on what are the drivers that are kind of pushing us in this direction of the clean energy transition, and also a bit of an overview on what we are doing from the ministry to accelerate this transition, and as you mentioned, to incentivize these kinds of clean solutions that enable a clean economy for the future. So I'm going to share just a couple of slides, very briefly, some figures that then you can later check in more detail in your office. So I'm going to discuss this from the point of view of green hydrogen, which is basically the energy that is going to be moving these ships in the future with a transition and all its caveats. So just a very brief summary on why are we talking about hydrogen today? Why do we discuss even hydrogen? And it's on our view and on the Hydrogen Council's view, because of three main drivers which have kind of converged today to give a newfound momentum to the hydrogen industry and its technologies. So one is the increasing stringent emission reduction commitments from the IMO, in the Paris Treaty, national commitments as well. Chile this year has updated its NDC commitment with an even more ambitious target to be carbon neutral by 2050, which is what science tells us we need in order to reduce the impact of climate change. The second big driver is the reduction in costs. So cost is important. You do not only need to talk about emissions, but the cost side of things is of course important, and even more important in Latin American countries in which public budgets are strained. There is much social need for education, for health, and for other issues that have to be tended to by the governments. And the third driver is a never seen before alignment of stakeholders, both public and private, all around the world, that are kind of rowing together in this same ship towards some clean energy solutions. So solar, wind, and now hydrogen are seen as the solutions for the energy transition, along with many others, such as energy efficiency and so on. But this alignment of factors has produced some interesting developments in projects, in technologies, and in policies. So why discuss hydrogen even more in Chile? Why in Chile and not in some other country? And it's because of what Christian mentioned. We have an amazing renewable potential. We could supply 70 times the electricity that we consume today only with renewable sources, and this would translate to roughly 160 million tons of hydrogen. So this is basically enough hydrogen to supply the entire world's demand for hydrogen, gray and green today, more than 2 times over. And it's not only a large quantity, but it's also a very good quality resource. Nick also mentioned this in his presentation. In Colombia, in Uruguay, in Argentina, in Chile, you can find amazing sites for renewable production, which is 70% of the cost of hydrogen. So where you have good renewable resource, you have cost competitive hydrogen. And Chile is one of those places. And not only is the resource there, but we also need it to reach our goals. We've estimated that about 20% of our carbon neutrality, so to speak, will be enabled by green hydrogen. And this is the case in many countries in the world. This is the case in the shipping industry as well. So we need to develop these technologies, and we need to develop these projects early on so that we can drop down the cost curve and reach our cost-effective carbon neutrality. But our internal demand is not enough. Even if we wanted to decarbonize the whole Chilean economy, our country is small, we have a small economy, a very low population. So our surplus renewable potential is a gateway for a new export industry in the country. Exports are the bread and butter of the Latin American economies, not only Chile. About 30% of Chile's GDP is from exports, and hydrogen could be a new added value product in a clean future economy. And we could export this hydrogen liquefied in an organic carrier, by ammonia, by methanol, to all the APAC region, and of course Europe, the European market as well. And being farther away doesn't mean that Chile is less competitive, because actually our production costs could be so much lower that we could compensate the bigger costs, because we are farther away than, say, Australia from Asia, because our production costs would be even more competitive. So what are we doing, and what's kind of the question that you posed, Nishan? So what's the role of the government and of the state in a Latin American economy regarding this inevitable transition? And for us, we've structured this in kind of 4 pillars. So one is the role of the state as a coordinator and as a leader in creating a vision, in promoting dialogue between private and public stakeholders, between international stakeholders and local players. And that's what we are doing in order to create a national green hydrogen strategy. That's our goal for this year. We hope to have it ready by November. The second role that we see is in creating regulation and setting up the rules for the private actors and the private initiatives. So we need to create a market through regulation and with studies and with technical cooperation, so that the companies can develop projects and technologies. The third pillar is supporting these projects, because early on costs are high, profits are low or non-existent. So you need some public support to make this happen. You need facilitation. This is something new. You need facilitation with the public audience. The general public doesn't know about hydrogen or ammonia or methanol. And so you need to bridge that knowledge gap. And the fourth pillar for us is international collaboration, because global problems require global solutions. And Latin American countries have their advantages, have vast natural resources, have a willingness to be leaders in this transition, but we do not have the same technological resources, the same human capital, the same budgets that would enable us to accelerate the transition. So we need to work together with other economies in the developed world, in Asia, in Europe, in North America, so that we can get these technologies in place and run the costs down. So I just wanted to end with some initiatives that are underway, so that we do not only speak in generalities, but we've seen that by laying up the rules and by laying up a vision, governments can foster private initiative even without huge public direct incentives, at least in Chile and in other Latin American countries which have great resources. So we've seen methanol projects, ammonia projects, projects for mining, projects for transport as well. So our question is, when will the first electrofuel refuel bunkering station will be deployed in Chile? And we pose this question as a when, because we know it's going to happen. The thing is, how fast could we have it here? And just to finalize some of the challenges for 2021, and I guess this is a challenge for many other LATAM countries in the next decade, which is how are you gonna kind of get this hydrogen hype into reality and actually deliver projects, deliver initiatives so that people can see that this is real, that this is the future,
Sure.
and that this works. Also, naturally, drafting strategies or roadmaps for the compliance with the IMO targets as well. Government's role are important in that direction, because the government is the one that can coordinate with the stakeholders, with other ministry, shipbuilders, shipping companies, and others. And of course, kind of, I guess the challenge for LATAM countries is to catch up with the energy transition. We've been a destination for investment in clean energy for a while now, but I guess there is a bit of a lag in the willingness of governments to be leaders in this transition. And we, as Chile, we are trying to catch up in this race, and are willing to put in the work to be there. So that's it. And very glad to join now the panel for some discussions.
Thank you, Benjamin. I think that graphic is actually, is that a spaceship that you have actually going there? So you're really thinking, this is Chile taking a real leadership of what shipping should look like far into the future. So really exciting, Benjamin, to hear about what Chile is planning and the vision over there. And then I want to turn to our next panelist, and then we'll come back to you, Benjamin and Christian. So Lavinia, if you're there, Lavinia Hollander. Lavinia is from the civil society side, an NGO based in Brazil, the Institute for Climate and Society. Lavinia, we're thrilled to have you today. So last but not least, and to hear your perspectives. And we've heard a little bit from Benjamin and Christian talking about, I think Christian mentioned, one of the transitions is how are we going to deal with the transportation of oil. So oil is about oil and gas, about 30 to 40% of all global shipping is transporting oil and gas, so fossil fuels themselves. So as that goes away, there's that 30 to 40% gap. And so that raises an interesting question about what is the role of multinational companies and vessel and organizations that are transporting, whether it's iron or other products on the ocean. Can they be a stimulus to transition into that new sector? So with that, I know you have some perspectives to share, so I'll turn over to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Nishan. Very glad to be here. And well, I have to say that being the last one to speak, that's really makes my job easier, right? Because I probably will touch the same points that everybody else has spoke about. Well, I do think, I think the key word I heard here was collaboration. And I do think that everybody has a role to play. And I think, and I'm gonna talk about it. And I think in the case of multinational companies, and I do think that investors and equity shareholders and debt holders have a lot to do in terms of pressuring those companies to show targets and to push forward decarbonization in the logistic chain. And I think we are starting to see this happening in Brazilian companies, for example. And I have to say that this is stronger in companies where you have an international base of shareholders. And this is starting to, Brazilian shareholders are starting to be aware of that for different reasons. And I think this is a very strong force in the market that can help this kind of decarbonization and can help companies to really be ambitious in terms of decarbonization. So, yeah. Go ahead.
Terrific. So on that, so you talked about the role of finance. So you see pressure coming in from debt holders, equity holders. What about customers? And do you see customers playing a role? Because so far it's almost been anonymous. You order something now from an e-commerce side or a product. We have no idea how that has been shipped. What's the carbon budget's been allocated? So where do you see the role of customers, of shipping companies in this equation?
Okay, so I think in the case of Latin America, this pressure from customers might be rather indirect. in the sense that, the pressure will probably come from customers in Europe who are pressuring, the companies that, the exporters from Brazil or from Latin America to decarbonize. In the case of Brazil, I do see this, or in the case of, I'd say most of Latin American countries, this kind of pressure will begin from investors and, debt and equity holders. And especially if you think about infrastructure companies or logistics companies or mining companies, they're not really on the top of the consumer mind, right? So you might have an indirect pressure from buyers abroad, but I would say that inside Latin America, I think the most pressure will come from investors. In the beginning, at least.
Right. So there's a lot more industrial customers. It's that B2B pressure that you'll see. And so who are some of the, where do you see some of the greatest progress being made? Who are some of the forward-thinking financial institutions, debt holders, pension fund holders making steps in this area?
I'd say pension funds, they're kind of, the forward-looking investors at this point, and banks as well. So banks are being very vocal in Brazil. They're dealing they're looking very closely to some issues that Brazil is having right now in terms of the supply chain and impact on deforestation, etc. And I think banks are being really, really vocal. And I'd say that they are more easily coordinated among themselves. So I think that's probably why they are the most vocal at this point, rather than, institutional investors or asset managers in Brazil. But I have to say that asset managers are also very aware of this kind of role that they have to play in decarbonization as well.
Terrific. And is there a forum for these discussions? I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of bilateral discussions that are going on, but how does this all come together to put pressure in a coordinated way so we have a coalition of the willing? Where are you seeing the most promising forums for these discussions?
I think they are kind of organizing themselves and also through civil society. For example, the Institute for Climate and Society has been putting together, a group of investors to make a public statement about decarbonization and really pressure companies to be ambitious. So I think civil society has a huge role to play. And I think civil society is kind of mobilizing, the banks and investors to coordinate themselves and be, and put pressure in a very coherent and cohesive way.
Fantastic. So, I mean, that's the importance of this kind of multi-stakeholder approach that we've talked about. We heard throughout from Benjamin's presentation, from Christian's presentation. This is not just, one industry knows or one sector knows. We need to bring in there's a role for every stakeholder to play over here. So with that, we have about 15 minutes of Q&A before we have to end. So if I ask Benjamin and Christian and also Nick to turn on their cameras so they can join Lavinia and I on this virtual stage that we have. And we have some questions that have come up. So I'll be asking those questions. Lavinia, maybe I'll start with you. I know I ended with you because we were talking about finance. There's a question here around the demand for carbon credits for shipping companies for emissions reduction. As many of you know, carbon credits are a key part of how we can actually transition or finance that transition. So maybe Lavinia, I'll ask you to respond first about carbon credits, and then Benjamin, maybe from a government perspective, then Christian from industry, the role of carbon credits in the green transition for shipping. Okay.
Can I get a different question? I was kind of looking at the question just because, there's someone who asked about the role of dropping alternatives in decarbonization.
Sure. Why don't we start with that question, then we can come back to the finance one, the carbon credit.
Yeah, and I think this is a very interesting one, specifically for Brazil, because that's the kind of question I get back from the government and from people in Brazil. Well, there's hydrogen and there's lots of opportunity, as the report says, but then Brazil, for example, has some drop-in alternatives, right? Biofuels, for example. We already have the supply chain, we have the infrastructure, etc. And I think, yes, that can be part of the solution. That's one point. On the other hand, we have to make sure that whatever we have in terms of biofuels is sustainable, in the sense that we have to consider whatever impact in land use we have, both direct and indirect in Brazil. That's one point. And the other thing is, well, there's a huge opportunity for Brazil. And the report shows it very quickly, very clearly, that Brazil has a huge potential for renewables. And I think because we have a drop-in alternative for biofuels, that doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue, the huge potential we have for developing, electric fuels, especially because we have the resources. Of course, we have to think about financing, but again, if we see that as an opportunity to attract investment, I would say that this would be a great stimulus for Brazil, economic stimulus for Brazil, especially because we're going to attract private investments, and that means that that's exactly what we need, because the fiscal situation in the country means that the government cannot be the one investing in infrastructure. So I do see this as a huge opportunity for the country.
Great. So with that, actually, let me just turn to Nick before I come to Benjamin and Christian. Nick, so Lavinia was talking about alternatives. We do see some questions about what about LNG? What about the current trajectory in these low sulfur fuels that we keep hearing from the IMO? Are they viable alternatives? We're told by the IMO and regulators that that's the pathway forwards. Tell us the reason why we should believe that, or why we should not, and why the three that you've outlined are the path forwards.
Yeah, thanks, Nishan. Well, it depends who you ask, really. I'm personally not of the view that LNG has a major role to play in decarbonization of shipping, for the simple reason that if you look at the life cycle emissions of LNG from production through to use, particularly the issues of methane slip along the supply chain, with methane being a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. I just think that we can do better. We do have better alternatives. To speak to the low sulfur diesel and that type of thing, it's that's still a fossil fuel, so we need to be moving away from that, even though it might have resulted in lower sulfur dioxide emissions. There is a discussion around drop-in synthetic diesels, for example. However, the discussion there also needs to focus on the full life cycle impact. I think that those might be better suited to smaller domestic vessels, where the economics and the technology is difficult to scale up to green electric fuel alternatives. But then you need to be getting your carbon dioxide from a carbon neutral source. So you need to be getting it from the air, and that makes it a lot more energy intensive and a lot more expensive. And then just one final comment on the biofuels example that Lavinia very was careful to point out. Brazil is a leader in biofuels, but we need to also be looking at horses for courses when it comes to decarbonization. And if you look at shipping's kind of second cousin, as it were, aviation, it's unlikely that electric fuels are going to have, particularly hydrogen and ammonia are going to have the possibility to decarbonize international flights, for example. And that's where biofuels, I think, come into their own as well. Although the supply constraints are significant when it comes to sustainable biofuels. So we need to be looking at third generation, maybe second generation. But if you look at all of the different sectors that need to decarbonize, we need to be careful of that we're choosing the right solutions for the right applications. And shipping just lends itself to electric fuels, particularly ammonia and hydrogen, very, very well.
Great, thank you. And with that, Christian, I'm going to come to you next. From an industry perspective, there have been some questions about, why shipping? Why should shipping lead this industry? And I see this lead this transition. And there are other questions about, we have these self-governing principles, the Poseidon principles, the IMO have got certain targets. So these all, industry set targets. One of the things that's interesting about the shipping industry, that it's only, I believe 1.5% of revenues are invested into R&D or innovation, compared to over 10% when it comes to the banking industry. So the shipping industry has historically underinvested in innovation, in R&D. Could that be an important lever of how we actually achieve some of these technological breakthroughs that you talked about in your presentation?
There is a couple of good questions in all that. Why shipping should take a leading role, as also pointed out in the report by Nick. I mean, probably it's not the only driver for these solutions. It's part of a whole chain. And for sure, these projects that require major investments will also need for the backup of power, electricity production demand, and industry, and demand from other people that support those sort of projects and investments. But shipping has a potential to absorb a good part of the demand for those fuels, and I think that the responsibility of shipping in that is just because of the volume of what it can provide in order to sustain those projects. You mentioned the industry as being self imposing targets or contributing with things like these Poseidon principles, and I think that's just basically because the industry has realized that there is a very relevant role to play there, and that stakeholders also require shipping to step up to its role, and I think it is quite optimistic. I mean, not optimistic, but realizable that through this action, shipping contributes to this transition.
Terrific. Great. And so with that, Christian, let me turn to Benjamin. Benjamin, Christian talks about some of those the industry's perspective, Poseidon principles and others. How is, from the Ministry of Energy perspective in Chile, how do you see other sectors moving, and particularly shipping? Do you see industry self-governing to get to those transitions, or do you see a role for government to actually come in and set some very crisp targets? Because you talked about the role of regulation and incentives into this sector.
It's a tough question, and I guess the answer is kind of mixed depending on the sector, on the specific sector. We have a recent history of a lot of dialogue and public-private agreements, voluntary agreements to navigate the energy transition. For example, last year we signed a voluntary agreement between the ministry and the 4 companies that operate coal power assets in the country to phase out these coal power plants by 2040 in a voluntary chronological calendar. And also in this hydrogen strategy, we are working with the companies, and voluntarily they are committing to carrying out some projects, to carrying out some studies. So we do see a lot of dialogue, not necessarily with hard targets, but these are on the table, and we are analyzing all the options. We do see a big role of synergy between the mining sector and the shipping sector, because the mining companies are looking to the markets of the future, and the future copper market, which is the primary export, will necessarily demand some share of green copper. The definition of that, of course, it's still to be defined, but it's a low carbon copper. And that's going to happen in all Latin American countries, be it soybeans or wood or salmon or whatever. And so shipping is part of that carbon footprint. So you need to take care of that part of the supply chain in order for your commodities to reach the European markets, the Japanese markets, the Chinese markets with a low carbon footprint. So then you can capture that green premium, so to speak. And we're going to see a very real test now in a couple of years when the European carbon frontier tax comes into action. So some commodities are going to be subject to these import carbon taxes, and we're going to see how that shifts or not global competitiveness in these particular imports.
Great. Thank you, Benjamin. And we've got time for one last question before we wrap up. And because this panel is focused on Central and Southern America, there's a good question here about the Panama Canal. I mean, this makes this entire region so strategic that one of the biggest shipping hubs is in the region, the Panama Canal. And so how can the role of the Panama Canal be a stimulus for this transition to zero carbon? I'll give all of you a final say. Benjamin, I'll start with you because of Chile. So how do you see the role of the Panama Canal in stimulating this move towards zero carbon?
Of course, the canal will have a strategic role to play because of its physical location, its logistical capability of providing fuels for a large number of routes and a huge number of vessels. But we also see a very big role to play in the Magallanes region, in the Magallanes Strait, in the very southern of the continent. Many shipping routes, of course, in the 20th century shifted towards the Central America Canal, but many shipping routes do pass through the very southern tip of the continent. And there we have some of the best winds in the world. You can, in the Patagonia, both in the Chilean and in the Argentinian side, you can get capacity factors up to 70 or 80% onshore for wind power plants. So that's a very strategic location because there you could produce electrofuels in a very competitive way to start supplying some routes, some vessels, have the first tests, become kind of a lab for these solutions. And then you can move on to the Panama Canal for a larger, more massive solution. That could be a roadmap to go. And I guess that's kind of the role that Chile is willing to play as well.
Terrific. Lavinia, Brazil, very strategic location for the Panama Canal. How do you see the role of the Panama Canal being a stimulus? You're on mute, Lavinia, if you just demute yourself.
Sorry.
Right.
I have to say that I would probably not add much to what Benjamin said. I think the role of both the South and the North, I mean, in terms of the Panama Canal and the Magallanes, it would be the integration of the whole Central and South America as a hub for hydrogen, for ammonia, for green or zero carbon fuels. And if I can add one last thing to what Nick said about LNG, for Latin America, there's an issue on infrastructure. So we cannot afford to build an infrastructure in Latin America that will be stranded within a few years, right? So I do not want to bet in an infrastructure for example, LNG that will be stranded soon. So we cannot afford that. So I would add this to what Nick said.
Christian, turning to you, why should Central and Southern America be at the forefront of this transition?
Well, a good part of it is contained in Nick's report. I mean, there is natural resources that provide a very good base for the production of these fuels. A word from my side on your question in relation to Panama Canal. If you look at the hubs for providing ships with the fuels and bunkers today, Panama has a very significant role. The report that Nick presented us with shows also about the flows that you see from shipping close to the places which are contained in the analysis. And that's of course very relevant, but probably in the future we will also see, because of its location, the Panama Canal, and once a good solution for moving hydrogen or electrofuels into the area can be provided, that Panama will probably retain a relevant part on this role of being a hub for bunker supply of ships, regardless of where it's physically produced. It will be moved. It will probably be economical to move and supply that. And the infrastructure will justify, with the whole flow of ships and shipping moving from and into there. So I think it will play. It can and will play a relevant role in this transition.
Terrific. Nick, final word to you. You produced this terrific, important report over here. What do you want to see happen next? What are the concrete actions that you want to see later this year or in 2021 to know that we are on the right path?
Well, thanks, Nishan. Earlier this year, a few weeks ago, we saw there was an announcement that came out of Saudi Arabia that there was an investment decision to invest in a large facility to produce green ammonia from the resources that they have in the desert, solar and wind, and they want to capitalize on those resources to be able to export a future sustainable fuel. So they want to produce green ammonia that they can export to the world. Now, Chile and Colombia and other countries, Brazil, other countries in South America have, they might have different type of renewable resources, but they're also just as good, the resources, particularly Chile. And so I'd like to see some announcements coming out of those countries for similar projects that are going to be realized, and investment decisions in the next few months, so that they'll be ready for deployment in the mid-2020s.
Terrific, fantastic. So thank you all very much. So this was a very engaging discussion. It was an important start for Climate Week, to start with shipping, an important industry. We see that Southern and Central America has an important role to play, some very concrete actions over here. So with that, I'd like to ask Dan just to join us to say some final words from the Ocean Conservancy perspective.
Yes, thank you, Nishan. And just to thank all the panelists for joining us today, and all the audience members for participating in this. I think what we've heard from a lot of the discussions has been that this is the start of a really promising journey for the shipping industry, and one that has to happen quickly and decisively. We have a lot of the tools to hand, and a lot of business and investment opportunities on the board. And I think we have, if there's any indication from the chat and from a lot of the navigation or the maritime community itself, excuse me, there's a lot of interest in participating from other sectors. I look forward to working with everybody in OC, looks forward to participating in many more discussions in the weeks and months to come.
Terrific. With that, thank you all very much. Have a very good Climate Week this week, and let's hope some of these recommendations move to action. With that, thank you all.